fall semester 2017. Today we have with us John Pearce from King's College London, who will talk to us about crowdsourcing archaeological data, the portable antiquities scheme. Please, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Rada. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm speaking from a, I have outside my window a very busy London street, so bear with me if there are interruptions from noises off. I'm now going to move to my slides. So what I'm talking about today is the portable antiquities scheme as a case study in deriving data from crowdsourcing within the field of heritage and conservation. So what I want to talk about in the following order is the context of the portable antiquities scheme, the legislative framework that it operates within, the kind of the broader context of metal detecting, what role crowdsources plays within it. I want to think too about what research insights we've derived from it, what are some of the ways in which we can illustrate the portable antiquities scheme's sort of academic achievements. And then I want to finish by exploring some of the challenges that it raises under different headings, whether it's used as a research tool, the way in which it's used for engagement, the extension of archaeology into a broader public, ethical challenges. And I should say in doing this, I'm not an employee of the portable antiquities scheme, so this is very much a personal perspective. However, I have worked a lot in collaboration with staff of the portable antiquities scheme at the British Museum and beyond. So I'm very much a fellow traveller. So it's important when you're kind of evaluating what I'm saying to bear in mind that I'm a partial insider within the scheme. I've collaborated closely, PhD supervision, research topics, getting undergraduates involved. But what I'm saying is not the kind of the official voice of the PAS. It is very much a personal perspective. So moving on to the kind of the first aspect, the broader context, why the PAS was set up. So some words first of all on kind of who sort of makes archaeology, who brings archaeological objects to wider attention. So we would think of traditional organizations like archaeological contractors, archaeologists working in advance of development projects, new road lines, new housing estates, and so on. We'd think of government agencies, universities, museums. We'd think of sort of local archaeology societies. These are the people involved in field work, dissemination, and so on. And then we would also have this kind of the more amorphous category of a wider public. Now, in terms of the actual discovery of objects, the public comprises predominantly metal detector users. So these are people who use metal detectors for hobby reasons. You can see a detecting rally going on in some fields in southern England at the moment. They go out explicitly looking for archaeological objects. So they are responsible for the vast majority of chance archaeological finds made in England and Wales. There is another public, people digging their garden, builders building a small extension on a house who might occasionally come across archaeological objects. But for the purpose of the consideration of the portable antiquities scheme, the public primarily comprises metal detector users. So the context of metal detecting, this will be quite alien, especially if you're watching this from many other countries in Europe. So metal detecting is legal in England and Wales and Scotland, as long as the landowner has allowed you to detect on their land, and as long as you're not detecting on what is already an inventorized scheduled archaeological sites. There are about 18,000 of these scheduled sites in England, but that's a tiny fraction of the overall kind of known archaeological sites and of the unknown ones. So metal detecting is legal here in much of the United Kingdom, and it's these detector users who are responsible for the vast majority of the finds reported to the portable antiquities scheme. As you can see, 96% is the figure cited from 2014 of finds documented under two categories that we'll look at shortly. In most other European countries, you're only allowed to use a metal detector if you've got a license, and typically that will be granted only if you're part of an official archaeological investigation by a governmental or similar similar agents. So everything I'm saying today is really about England and Wales. I should note in passing that portable antiquities scheme-like projects are now being set up in other parts of continental Europe, especially kind of around the North Sea. So the Netherlands has a PAS equivalent, and they're under development, as I understand, in Denmark and Sweden as well. The first number to give you a sense of the hobby, there's an estimate that there are maybe not quite 10,000 active metal detector users in the UK, and this has been the case from the 1970s onwards, when the hobby became, the metal detectors became cheap enough for people to practice it as a hobby. The estimate is of similar numbers in France. To give you a sort of visual image to demonstrate that scale, here's that same rally in operation. So the metal detectorists' cars parked, and then people using their detectors distributed across this stubble field in southern England. Another kind of memento of the scale. This is one detectorist's kind of collection. These are the nasty bits that remained in the buckets rather than being sorted and moved into cases and classified and so on. So you can see here a group of material from North Lincolnshire of all periods. You can see Roman pottery mixed up with parts of tractors. So metal detectorists pick up non-metal materials as well as the metal objects that they find with the detector. And these collections, especially collections accumulated over decades of practicing the hobby, can be really substantial. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of individual objects. So it's been a hobby practiced on a large scale from the 1970s onwards in the UK and beyond, and that's meant, as a general rule, that most of the objects found by metal detectorists were not documented in any way. They went into private collections, they went onto the antiquities market, they were sold, lost, destroyed, whatever fate may have happened to them. The only legal framework in operation up until the late 1970s was the medieval-derived law of treasure trove, which applied in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And under that legal framework, operating till 1997, precious metal objects, if you discovered them, you had to report them to the coroner. You'd then take advice from a national museum in London or Cardiff or in Belfast as to whether they qualified as treasure and therefore they were the property of the state. And the National Museum had to carry out 3 tests. Are they made of precious metals? Were they buried with the intention of recovery? And were the original owner or the heirs of that owner unknown? So for something to qualify as treasure, therefore to be the property of the state, had to meet all 3 of those tests. It's not difficult in retrospect to see what the major problems were with this kind of approach. That only a small number of objects were ever deemed to be treasure trove. It was very difficult to prove treasure trove, especially to prove that the objects had been deposited with the intention of recovery. How could you do that for a late Roman hoard or a Bronze Age group of material? So there was difficulty of applying the law. Often fines simply weren't reported. Major categories of fines would not be included. So a votive deposit, a kind of gift to the gods, or a burial wouldn't be treasure because they had not been deposited with the intention to recover. When a group of material was found, only the precious metal parts of it would be the treasure trove. So the rest of the objects found in association could be disposed of as the finder wished. So the slide shows an example of a hoard from Roman Norfolk with a typical mixture of precious and non-precious metal materials. That cluster of little red blobs you can see in the kind of center of the screen. These are carnelian gemstones from fingering, so they wouldn't have been included under treasure. So the late 90s, with a kind of a growing consciousness of the problem of the scale of metal detecting, the loss of archaeological information, the ineffectiveness of the treasure trove legislation, a new act replaced the law of treasure trove, the Treasure Act, applying to objects found after 1997. And it came up with a new, much more workable definition of what had to be reported as treasure if you found it. So all those, the stipulation that you had to know that it had been deposited with the intention to recover, that was set aside. So the new definitions are related to material and context and age. So you can see that it's objects other than coins, which are at least 300 years old and have this minimum precious metal component, 10% gold or silver. Also, all the other coins from the same find, as long as they're at least 300 years old. And then if less than 10% of gold or silver, at least 10 coins must be present. So this meant that large base metal groups of material from the Roman period of the coins could be included under treasure. All the other objects found along with the precious metal items are included. They have to be reported as well. Since then, there's been some nuancing. So 2003, the Act was amended so that prehistoric, so especially Bronze Age and Iron Age, base metal deposits, so deposits of objects that were only in copper alloy or might be in lead or something like that. If they were found as a group, they would also, the Treasure Act would apply to them. So if you, from now on, if you find an object or group of objects meeting these criteria, then you must report them to the coroner. There was a major change in incentivization. So if they are reported, deemed to be treasure, and a museum expresses an interest in acquiring them, then the finder and landowner will be rewarded with the current market value of those objects. Under the treasure trove legislation, museums might sometimes pay rewards to people, but there was no certainty as to whether your reporting of treasure would be acknowledged with any kind of financial remuneration. But now, should a museum decide to acquire a treasure object, then you will be awarded the market value of it, and that market value is determined by a committee that includes museum curators, archaeologists, and antiquities dealers. So the Treasure Act was a kind of a major plank in trying to change the approach towards the finding of archaeological objects by metal detector users. The other major plank was the establishment of the Portable Antiquities scheme. So this built on earlier sporadic regional initiatives where archaeologists had tried to work with metal detectorists to get them to bring their material in to be documented and then returned. So this has been set up as a voluntary scheme which encourages members of the public who find archaeological objects to report them to a locally based archaeologist. The focus here was to report them so that a record could be made of that object, but then unless it was a treasure item, it would then be returned to the finder. So the focus of the Portable Antiquities scheme was not to acquire lots more objects to stuff into museums, but to make to document the object, and in particular document its provenance. Where has it come from? With as high a resolution as possible. Where has this thing been found? So a discussion document to establish this launched in 1996, and in 1997 a pilot scheme was set up. So the Portable Antiquities scheme comprises now, after various developments over the last 20 years, a central hub in London based at the British Museum, which includes the treasure registrars, specialist finds advisors for objects dating to different periods, Roman numismatists, for example, advising on finds of Roman coins. So there's the central treasure team, and then within the regions of England and Wales, a distributed network of archaeologists. All those little X's record the presence of an individual finds liaison officer. So the finds liaison officers are at the front line of the Portable Antiquities scheme. So they'll typically be based in a local authority. They might be based in a local museum or in an archaeology service. So they are established under the auspices of a partnership between the British Museum and local museums, local archaeological services. The funding all comes centrally. It comes from the state and it's distributed through the British Museum. So the pilot scheme in 97, expanded in 99, and then this national network has applied since 2003. There are some further expansions to that, in particular the extension of the staff of the PAS by volunteer recorders, but that's something I'll come to a little bit later. So what is the PAS doing? One of the things that's not listed on here is partly it's putting the provisions of the new Treasure Act into practice. So these are the people, the finds liaison officers based in the individual regions, are the first port of call to report objects that may be treasure. But what are the overall aims of the PAS? Well, it was primarily to, to get that research knowledge that was being lost by making a documented record of individual archaeological objects. And in order to do that, there's a sort of an evangelistic role. So finds liaison officers are encouraging finders to report their finds and to report them in a way that kind of is most beneficial, both kind of archaeologically speaking and also for the longevity of the object. And then there's a sort of wider role to present to local and regional communities what is the interest of these finds that are coming in. Why should we care that we've got this greater understanding of the distribution of objects across a landscape? The role is also to try and enable research on this, whether it's by undergraduate students or PhD students or continuing education students or whoever it might be, and to try and see where other members of the public might get involved in archaeology. So the following slides will give you some kind of illustrations of that PAS activity. So a big part of it is this evangelizing role. Going along to metal detector club meetings, you've got a typical environment. The gender balance is a pretty typical one for metal detector hobbyists. So you're going along, you're giving a presentation to finders, you're maybe talking about the individual objects they bring in. In terms of best practice, the crucial thing is to try and acquire as high as possible a resolution of geographical provenance information, especially by encouraging people to use GPS so that you can record an object, if possible, to the nearest square meter. They're also giving guidance on conservation, how to treat your object so that it will have some longevity, a longevity that allows it to be documented in a state where it's not being damaged by some inadvertent misuse of materials on it to try and clean it up. So especially conservation and georeferencing are two of the key areas where finds liaison officers are trying to promote best practice. And then a reminder, there's that wider public engagement. What do these finds mean for a local community? How is historic understanding promoted in a particular area? How do people engage with the history of their landscape? So we've got bearded, bespectacled archaeologist on the left, and some local interested enthusiasts on the right, getting a sense of the range of material that's coming. So Archaeological Finds Day is run by museums or universities. This is a typical context in which to put on this kind of event. So to give you a sense of this outreach scale, this is taking the Portable Antiquities Scheme's activity over 2 years, and this level of activity is approximately what's going on now. Almost 200,000 people reached by these outreach events. Lots of individual metal detecting clubs contacted, a high number of club meetings. So most finds liaison officers will be going to a club meeting a couple of times a month to say, this is why your material is important. This is what we can do with it. This is why it's interesting. I say in passing, I've put this material in the bibliography, but there's lots of statistical information about the scale of finding, the scale of outreach through the annual reports produced by the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which now run up to 2015 and are available on the website. If you want to to get a sense of what is being found, then the key interface for the PAS is the website. So the URL is here. This was a project that was a born digital project. So it didn't come into existence with a huge paper archive backlog to digitize and disseminate. From the start, records were being created digitally. So the local finds liaison officers create their finds records, their object description, their provenance information, their image. That's uploaded in real time, more or less, to a database. There are stages of validation. A specialist may look at it to say, yeah, you've got this right, the object record is okay. There's a forum amongst the finds liaison officers to discuss, uncertain objects. You're dealing with material from the Paleolithic to the Victorian period, so no one can be expected to specialize in all of that. But once it's passed through this process of documentation, it is then available to whoever wishes to consult the database. Some information is restricted, which we'll see in a few slides. So it's a project that from the start has been a fundamentally digital one. The next slides you're going to see give you a sense of some of the statistics, what's the scale of this project. So first of all, this is the number of finds recorded annually, starting in 1998 and going up to 2011. The 2011 figure is now pretty representative for most subsequent years. So the number of finds recorded starts off at the beginning, when the project begins, in the low thousands per year, and by 2011, more or less 100,000 objects are being recorded each year. As well as that increase in objects, there's also a massive increase in the number of treasure cases. So the reporting of items or assemblages that have been deemed to fall under the treasure legislation. You remember there was this key legal change happened between 96 and 97. So you'll see in the late 80s, early 90s, a very small number of annual treasure cases. And that's increased, the number of treasure cases has more or less increased 100-fold over the last 15 years. So there are now approximately 1,000 treasure cases each year. So objects or assemblages that meet the revised criteria that we looked at earlier on. In many cases, museums, though, even where it's been decided that the object or assemblage meets the treasure criterion, museums won't acquire them. So it's not all of these objects or assemblages are being acquired. So some more stats. This is kind of comparing the PAS in 2014 and the PAS in 2009 to 10 to show you the kind of some of the evolving characteristics of the data that are coming in. So over time, even in that 5-year period, the dominance of metal detectorists as the finders of objects has increased from 88% to 96%. So the PAS, though it's directed in theory at anybody, sorry, we're going to be interrupted now by sirens. In theory, it's directed at any archaeological finders. In practice, it's mainly metal detectorists who are reporting their finds. You'll see the number of finds coming in is over 100,000 each year. The vast majority of these finds, and a majority that's increased between 2010 and 2014, are made on cultivated land. So this is metal detectorists targeting ploughed fields, where the plough has gone in, disturbed an archaeological site, brought objects closer to the surface, and made them more susceptible to detecting. You'll also see with these stats how the resolution information for provenance has improved. So in 2010, 88% of records were to the nearest 100 square meters. By 2014, that applied to 99% of finds. And the PAS has now made that a mandatory recording requirement. They won't record objects usually unless that precision of geographical information accompanies the object when it's brought in. That level of resolution means that the object record is suitably precise for local heritage inventories. So these are the inventories that local archaeological services will keep in England and Wales that are used as a basis for evaluating planning applications. So if someone wants to build a new road housing estate, then the previous information available on the historic environment record, that's the HER, will be examined, and this will now incorporate portable antiquities data because its geographical resolution is suitably specific. What is very difficult to know is the proportion of objects found by metal detectorists that are eventually recorded on the PAS database. Katie Robbins, whose very useful overview of the PAS and its operation and its research impact is on the bibliography, estimates it's somewhere between 40 and 70% of finds. She did a lot of work with detectorists on the Isle of Wight and in Hampshire to talk with them about how much they were finding, and of that, how much were they actually how much were they wishing to report to the PAS. So that statistic, the 40 to 70%, is based on her survey of detecting practice. Some stats, well, one set of stats for objects by period. So the objects that are found and reported date from all periods of human occupation of England and Wales, from the Paleolithic to the modern period. In general, artifacts that are less than 300 years old aren't recorded unless they're of a very kind of particular and unusual character. So the modern number is very low. At the other end of the spectrum, the Paleolithic, The number of artifacts is also low for obvious reasons. Metal detecting does not get very much Paleolithic, Mesolithic or Neolithic material. There are one of the other contributors to the Portable Antiquities scheme are amateur archaeologists who have an interest in lithics, especially in flint. So the Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic material will come primarily from reporting their records. Occasionally metal detectors will spot an axe as they're walking over a field, but this is the Stone Age material is predominantly from hobby archaeologists. Within the Metal Ages, you can see that the Roman period predominates in terms of the sheer number of records. This was a census taken in 2013, and there are approximately 20,000 new Roman objects documented each year. So the number of Roman objects will now be well over 300,000, and of those, about 80% are Roman coins. So Roman coins are the single most frequently documented artifact type within the Portable Antiquities scheme. So well over the total number of records for the PAS is now heading, I think, towards 1.5 million, and that number of records is comparable in scale with the number of records held on the British Museum's Merlin database for all of the objects within its collection. Obviously, the BM collection is one that's been developed over 250 years, whereas the PAS scheme has been in operation for 20 years. So that gives you a sense of the kind of the scale of the research resource. Okay, so that's distribution through time. Now we're looking at distribution through space, and apologies kind of for those of you looking at this outside the UK, this is going to seem perhaps a slightly kind of particularistic and sort of myopic approach. So each black dot was a find reported to the PAS up to 2013. The similar mapping now would produce pretty similar results, just more black dots. So those areas that are already very black would be even blacker. So you can see that PAS finds are documented from across a very broad span of England and Wales, but there are key exceptions. So the map also shows you relief, so height above sea level, and you can see that with increasing height, the number of records drops off. So these big areas without many finds in upland Wales, southwest England, and northern England, these are upland pastoral areas where very little arable agriculture takes place. So you don't have the plough bringing material to the surface. Whereas the areas with a really thick distribution of finds, if this could be coded to show the numbers better, we'd see our thickest distribution are in the counties of eastern England, from north and east Yorkshire up here north of the Humber, down into East Anglia. This is England's prairie belt, so this is where you're getting deep ploughing, intensive agriculture, bringing material up to the surface. Some of the other gaps that you can see in here are gaps in modern urban areas. So here we've got London, so very little farmland available here for detecting. This is the fens, and this brings me to another aspect of the kind of the bias in the PAS. A major bias is where modern intensive agriculture is taking place. That sucks detecting towards it. But also the landscape of England and Wales has changed. Much of this area that's a blank here, so northern Cambridgeshire, western Norfolk, the south end of Lincolnshire, these are marginal zones. These are intertidal zones, marshy areas up to the early modern period. So very little in this area, very little permanent human occupation. So we've got a series of filters that we have to think about to explain this distribution. It's partly to do with modern land use. It's partly to do with landscape change. Some part of it also is likely to do with the kind of the relative wealth and density of human occupation and activity in antiquity. So it may be that these very black areas in eastern England are also more densely settled and richer than some of these areas in central and western and southwest England. So a whole series of ancient and modern factors kind of condition the availability of PAS data. The biases, it's worthwhile saying, the biases are quite different to some other kinds of archaeological information. So if we were to have a distribution map of Roman sites, for example, known by traditional archaeological means, then upland northern England, especially through here, which is the line of Hadrian's Wall, or upland Wales would have many more Roman dots on the map because we've got the presence of Roman military garrisons there. Those garrisons are not places where you can legally detect, so no one detecting anywhere near a scheduled ancient monument, which a known Roman garrison would be reporting it to the PAS. Okay, so this is the takeaway image for kind of understanding the distribution of PAS material. It's very heavily conditioned by modern agricultural practice and the detecting activity associated with it. Before I move on to look at kind of some of those individual dots to try and differentiate amongst them and to think about, you know, what are we learning from this, I also wanted to briefly say something about public roles in the PAS, and in particular the recent Past Explorers initiative. So in terms of crowdsourcing, this is quite a particular kind of project. In that the first part of the crowdsourcing is to get the kind of the finders of objects to become reporters. So in a rather passive way, they are part of the data generation process. You know, that process of discussion, persuasion, evangelization gets a large number of individuals, somewhere around 10,000, regularly to report the objects that they're finding. They report their object, someone else documents it. It usually goes back to them unless it's a treasure find. So it's engaging on a large scale, and it's worthwhile saying that this is engaging a kind of a community that would not traditionally be engaged by other aspects of archaeology. So the finders tend not to be people who are typical members of local archaeology societies. They don't that often visit archaeological exhibitions in museums. So it engages in that way with a different demographic. An outcome of people being persuaded to report their finds was also a growing interest by those same people in kind of what can we actually learn in terms of understanding our local past from those finds. So finds liaison officers have typically had quite a lot of volunteers working for them. Those volunteers tend to be either finders or typically kind of archaeology students wanting a bit of work experience to help with documentation. A recent initiative, though, the Past Explorers initiative, was designed to enhance those volunteer opportunities. I think it's pretty difficult if you're a finds liaison officer trying to cope with the volume of material coming in, trying to train up volunteers and trying to also to get them experienced in material distributed over a wide time range. That's pretty time intensive, and you can't do very much of it. You can only ever work with a small number of volunteers. So funding has been secured from the National Heritage Lottery Fund for a 5-year program for training volunteers. So this pays the salaries of staff who are going to train those volunteers. It also pays the expenses of volunteers coming to training events, travel expenses to allow them to come and be based in a local museum to work with finds liaison officers. So to extend that sort of rather passive engagement into a more active one. Nonetheless, in terms of the kind of the range of crowdsourcing initiatives documented by Dunn and Hedges or by Andy Bevan and his collaborators, the PAS, the role of the crowd remains nonetheless relatively limited. They are the kind of the generators of new potential data, either as reporters or as volunteer documenters, but they're not having the kind of the role in the direction of new research that in other crowdsourcing initiatives volunteers sometimes have. So that's a kind of a comment to put the sort of the crowd, that particular part of the crowdsourcing element of the PAS in context. Now a few pretty pictures to show you some of the research benefits. The research benefits are partly about finding significant new individual objects, you know, a small number of really quite unexpected things. So on the right in this slide, famous statue of Marcus Aurelius, arm extended, exercising clemency towards some unknown foe, now in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. On the left, a bronze kind of 2/3 life-size head, found not by a metal detectorist but by a farmer ploughing his field in Northamptonshire in the early 1970s, kept this head by the fire for the next 30 years, brought it into a fine stay in his local museum. It was eventually acquired by the Ashmolean. The portrait features look like a Roman emperor of the mid to late 2nd century AD. The closest parallel are the portrait features of Marcus Aurelius, but with this high degree of stylization, reflecting kind of local kind of Northwest European artistic tradition. So it's a nice example of kind of Romanizing portrait subject meets local artistic style. So a kind of, some significant evidence for understanding cultural change in Roman Britain. Another significant individual objects. It's known as the Staffordshire Moorlands pan, found in the early 2000s. It's a small object. It fits within the palm of your hand. It's lost the handle that would originally have been attached to it. You'll see some writing around the rim of the object. This is the name of a series of forts at the western end of Hadrian's Wall. So these names that are transcribed, Mais, Cogabata, and so on. And then at the end of the inscription, it says probably along the line of the wall of Elias, along the line of Hadrian's Wall. And then this is the object of Draco. Underneath the line of text is another example of this kind of Celtic curvilinear ornament using this colored enamel. So the object seems to be some kind of souvenir of Hadrian's Wall, but in its form, it kind of mixes both indigenous and imported traditions. So again, it's another kind of fascinating object for trying to understand cultural change in Roman Britain. One of the aspects of good practice that the FLOs try to persuade finders to do is, if they find a group of objects in situ, then not to excavate it themselves, but to leave it and to report it so that it can be excavated by professional archaeologists. So this is an example of one of these circumstances where the finder found a group of coins, realized it was a late Roman hoard from the date of the coins that he could see, and then reported it to archaeologists. So the vessel that contained these coins was dug. It's a vessel that stands about 1 meter high. It has more than 50,000 coins. Latest one dated to AD 305. From being able to excavate the vessel, take it back to the laboratory, excavate down through the coins, through the vessel, you could see that individual groups of coins were being deposited sequentially over time. This was not a hoard that had been made all at once, but had been made in batches, possibly by kind of repeated ritual performance, going along, opening up the neck of the vessel, putting another batch of coins in. One can also, as well as looking at individual artifacts or groups of artifacts, the sheer scale of the data allows you to play around with distributions across a landscape. I suggested in the exercise associated with this session that to get a sense of landscape distribution, as well as what you can and can't do with PAS data, depending on your access to it, that you look at the distribution of Roman brooches from Greater London. So going into the database, searching using the geographical criteria and the date criteria and the find criteria to find brooches from Roman London. The screenshots here are taken from someone who's logged in as a user who's allowed to see full geographical information. So when you do this search, you'll get your list of finds. You can plot the distribution of that list of finds within the PAS. So as a public user without any kind of further clearance, you'll be able to see this kind of mapping. You can zoom in a bit, but that's as far as you get with public clearance. What you can do is apply to the PAS as a research user, and that allows you access to the full recorded data. And this will allow you, as one of the enhanced characteristics to which you'll be granted access, to look at that distribution using its full geographical precision. So our little find spots here of Roman brooches from central London turn out to be, well, where you'd expect them to be in central London. There are no green spaces to detect. So these 1, 2, 3, 4 brooches here, these are all from the Thames foreshore. People using their metal detector at low tide to working their way along the foreshore and then documenting this material. The Tower of London is at the eastern extremity of Roman London. So Roman London is on both banks of the Thames. It extends from the Tower of London in the east to to Blackfriars Station in the west. It's also over in Southwark. So much of this material that's being found on the foreshore will be eroding out of Roman archaeological deposits through river action. Additionally, if you follow through with the suggested exercise, you'll be able to see the other kind of research benefits that you get. You get downloadable data that you can play with, you get images of objects and so on. I wanted to show you in the next couple of slides some examples of distribution on a large scale that you can get out of the PAS. So this is Roman brooches are after Roman coins are one of the most frequently recorded artifact types. So this is a distribution plot of about 18,000 brooches found up to 2013. The darker the red, the greater the density of brooch find spots in any one area. The darker the blue, the lesser the density. So you can see that for Roman brooches overall, the highest densities are reached in those prairie landscapes of eastern England, from North Yorkshire up here down to East Anglia, and then sporadically across central southern England. So it's not surprising where this material is turning up. It's turning up in the areas where most PAS finds come from. You can plot it, you can take your data and plot it as in this case, a kernel density plot, or you can plot single find spots. This is taking just one particular category of brooch, a head stud brooch. It's got this little stud at the top of the bow of the brooch, and looking at their distribution. What comes out from this that hadn't previously been appreciated was just how regionally focused the distribution of this brooch type was. So these little red dots are finds of this particular brooch type, and they very much cluster in the counties around the Humber in northeast England, with some correlation with the line of Roman road. So these lines that you can see threaded across the landscape, this is the Roman road network. So one gets a nice sense of the regionality of a particular costume type, enabled by big data through the PAS. It would be painful to have to do the equivalent work drawing from archaeological fieldwork reports. It would take you a long time to produce a comparable distribution map. You can look at the distribution of one particular type. You can take all artifacts from a particular period and look at their distribution across a historic landscape. So this is a map taken from a King's PhD project from a few years ago, done by Tom Brindle, looking at the landscape, the impact on our understanding of ancient landscapes from PAS data. This is a small chunk of Worcestershire and Warwickshire in the West Midlands of England. Centred, there's a Roman town here. The colour coding black is previously known archaeological information of different kinds, depending on shapes. Yellow, the PAS finds. So you can see that within this landscape that's quite well known, so the small town here with the Roman road line running through it, and then a series of a few triangles, rural settlements known around it. When you compare the distribution of clusters of PAS material, you can see that human occupation in this landscape emerges as significantly denser. Taking the two data sources together, we get a much more nuanced and fine-grained understanding. And because many of these yellow clusters are made up of Roman coins, we get quite a good sense of development of a landscape over time with the chronological precision that Roman coins enable. This is zooming out of that particular case study and comparing the distribution of PAS data in coloured pink and historic environment data known from traditional archaeological sources in blue. And you can see that they sometimes overlap, but there are major areas that we only know about really from PAS data. For example, in eastern Warwickshire or in western Worcestershire. So the PAS is because of the enhanced research opportunities, because of this engagement with a public that's not traditionally drawn into kind of most forms of archaeological public engagement. It's a project that's often been celebrated. So this is a slide taken when the Labour government from 1997 to 2010 was in power. This was the Labour Minister of State for Culture in the centre, David Lammy, with the Finds Liaison Officer Frank Basford on the right, and a finder of this particular Anglo-Saxon object on the left. David Lammy sort of coined this phrase, unsung heroes of heritage. That's maybe a questionable statement, but nonetheless, this is the the achievements of the PAS have come to kind of wider attention because of scale, dissemination through digital means, and because of its engagement with a public that's not been traditionally part of the sort of the archaeological community. All this showing you lots of slides with big numbers, distribution maps, labels like heritage heroes. All this risks being a little bit uncritical, you know, trying to sell the PAS with too much puff. So what I want to finish on are some questions and challenges that the PAS raises. So dealing with them under these headings. So first of all, an incomplete framework. There are still problems with getting people to report and make available objects, or for objects to come into a publicly accessible collection. The slide that you're seeing at the moment is one of the most famous PAS finds. It's a Roman cavalry helmet. It's a helmet that would have been worn during a kind of a military display, a bit like the Edinburgh tattoo. So not in combat, because it's made of copper alloy, but it consists of the headpiece here and a face mask. So a visor, you lift up the visor in order to put the thing on. So it's the face of this kind of beautiful youth with his curly hair above. He's wearing a kind of floppy Phrygian cap, so he looks like some kind of Trojan hero, and he's got a griffin on top. This was found in 2009 and sold at auction for more than £2 million in 2010. There are a series of issues with this find. As a copper alloy object, the silvering that you can see on the visor is not silver, it's tinning. So there's no precious metal component in it. So it doesn't fall under the stipulations of the current Treasure Act. It's not a treasure item, so the finder can do with it as they please. It was found not in a usual setting for the PAS material. I've said that most PAS material comes from intensively ploughed landscapes of eastern England. Crosby Garrett is not in one of these landscapes. It's an upland landscape in Cumbria. This is the village of Crosby Garrett. Above the village are a series of fells going up several hundred meters that are entirely pastoral, and because they're never ploughed, they have very good preservation of standing earthworks of prehistoric and Romano-British settlement. And the Crosby Garrett helmet was found in these by digging into one of these earthworks. This was a geophysical survey subsequently done of the site. Don't worry about the detail. All you need to be aware of is that anything that's showing up in black is a likely archaeological feature. There's a lot of archaeological features on this site, well preserved settlement evidence, but the finder of the object, when they got their signal, they dug into this well preserved archaeological feature. It wasn't protected by law, so they were within their legal rights, but they extracted it from a stratigraphic context. So that connection between stratigraphic context and object was pretty heavily compromised. When it first came to London, it looked like this. These are the fragments of the headpiece that you can see here, and then this is the state of the visor. So the visor in rather better condition, but still, you know, missing quite a lot of it. The finds liaison officers tried to persuade the finder to sell it direct to a museum, allowing investigative analytical conservation work to be done. But in the end, the finder decided not to do that. So restoration was done, using the image that you saw in the first slide. You can see a small version of it here during the auction. I'll just go back and show you this. It is a visually spectacular piece. There have been additional pieces put in there in order to make up for the holes, but that's less important than the fact that during the cleaning and restoration, all of that kind of potential residue, corrosion material on the metal that might have told you about how the thing had been wrapped up, the organic components it might have had, the possible padding of the helmet, the burial environment. Was it in a bag? Was it buried as a votive? Was it discarded as rubbish ready to go into the melting pot? All of that kind of information is lost through the restoration process. Restoration without analytical conservation. The object was bought by a private buyer and remains in their private collection. The purchaser of the helmet has regularly made it available temporary exhibitions. You can see a list of temporary exhibitions on the slide. So it has been possible, both in London and outside London, to see this object from time to time, but at the discretion of the owner. So there are historically significant objects that fall outside the remit of the Portable Antiquities Scheme. How is that stipulation of treasure to be revised, perhaps, in order to allow this kind of object? It's a very rare type of object. How should we incorporate that within the scheme? There's also a kind of a wider ethical issue about the PAS. As you'll have gathered, it's a pragmatic approach. It's based on pragmatism, seeing that metal detecting is a very widespread, well-established, entirely legal hobby. So how do you kind of work with finders in order to sort of minimize the damage that's done? How can you extract some research material? How can you extract a better understanding of a local historic landscape? It's pragmatic. Nonetheless, a series of accusations continue to be leveled at it. For a summary of these, have a look at David Gill's article from 2010, and for a more extreme version of them, for a polemical observations on the Portable Antiquities Scheme, Paul Barford's blog. So the arguments are that it continues to promote the wider antiquities market in general, the ownership of antiquities, because it's focusing on it allows people to continue owning them unless they're treasure. It focuses more on ownership than on stewardship, than on responsibility for curating these. The highlighting of individual finds, whether or not they're reported to the Portable Antiquities Scheme, has been argued to encourage treasure hunting. That when you make a fanfare about the success of the PAS in getting a new object into a museum, a finder has agreed to sell it, well, that just kind of promotes the hobby, leads to metal detecting and associated damage of archaeological sites on a larger scale. As part of that, it's also sometimes claimed to promote illegal activity. So night hawking is trespass, usually under cover of darkness, on known archaeological sites, especially on scheduled ancient monuments, in order to loot them. There has been some studies done of this, and it's quite difficult to see spikes in illegal activity after the reporting of prominent finds, but it's a charge that continues to be levelled. And it's also argued to muddy the waters. It says, well, if antiquities continue to circulate legally within Britain, because of this pragmatic framework, does this mean that material can come into Britain from overseas, be given a kind of false provenance? So it kind of connects to the wider antiquities market, the wider market in illegal material, and kind of continues to facilitate the existence, or indeed the expansion of that wider antiquities market. So that remains an ethical issue to engage with. There's also the kind of the various aspects of kind of how do we understand this as a research resource, as a heritage management tool? How do we kind of keep up with this material? It is a pretty complex data set. I alluded when I was showing you that map of England and Wales to the various different factors that underlie the distribution of PAS data, whether it's the PAS data as a whole or individual data sets, that there are a series of filters from deposition through what gets preserved, what survives in the plough soil, what kinds of things do metal detectorists seek to report, what kinds of things do FLOs prioritize in their recording. You can't straightforwardly map human activity from it. There are all kinds of biases underlying it. Have a look at Katie Robbins' work, also a nice paper in Britannia from 2016 by Hilary Cool and Mike Baxter, exploring some of those in a little bit more detail. The danger is, because almost at the touch of the button you can produce a nice distribution map, is that it gives you sort of false confidence in PAS data as being representative, when it really needs to be examined in tandem with archaeological data drawn from other sources, which has different biases applied to it. So uncritical use is to be discouraged, but is always a danger from a research point of view. Practicalities. The PAS is in part a victim of its own success. I showed you that massive increase in the number of treasure cases that's taken place since 1997. So in 2014, more than 1,000 cases of treasure reported. This becomes very difficult to process because it still has to go through the coroner's court. So, and the sheer scale of objects, documenting 100,000 finds a year, liaising with finder groups, public events to engage the wider public, transferring the PAS data to local heritage inventories is a very substantial burden on personnel in a period where funding has been frozen at the level, I think, granted in 2015. So there hasn't been any increase since then, but inflation has bitten into that funding. And that consideration of funding raises the issue about continuity. So the PAS data, it's held on a database that's run by the British Museum. It's a database in continual evolution. There's continual entry of new data into it. The database itself continues, though to a lesser degree than before, to be tweaked. Where does the funding for that come? Where does the funding for that come from? What will happen to it when governments, heritage organisations make decisions about where they're going to spend their money? It's had 20 years. How will that work out in future? What will happen to the data if, in the worst case scenario, the PAS as an institutional framework is removed? And then the final thing I wanted to throw out. Here are some numbers of users. The scale is pretty big in terms of individual visitors looking at the PAS website. It's a much smaller number of users who deal in greater detail with the material. So on my question here, this is a very large scale crowdsourcing project, but it is crowdsourcing in that way that gets the participants to contribute to a project of which the objectives have been defined by the experts. Does the PAS continue to be contributory in this way only, or is there scope for formulating some new research goals that maybe include the kind of some more bottom-up contributions from those who are working as finders or as finds liaison officers? What priorities might they introduce to it? And I flagged the micropasts project as an example of a project where, or as an example of a framework where both contributory participation and also development of research goals is facilitated. Thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. So I'm going to return now. Hopefully you can see me again. So over to you, Radha.
Radha, you're still muted.
Was I speaking with them?
I can hear you now.
Yes. I was saying thank you very much for this really great session. This really was about heritage and conservation and outreach, I think. At the same time, you've addressed some sensitive issues and ethical matters which do raise debate everywhere and anytime, I think, and problems for which we do not have perfect solutions at the time. I have a list of questions, but first let's see if anybody else from the Hangouts has any questions.
I have a couple of things as well, but I'll maybe let you go first because John's heard most of my questions before.
Okay, if nobody wants to say anything right now, I will. They are more about the first part of the presentation, not necessarily the PAS platform in itself, because on that the presentation was very clear. And so, did I understand this correctly? You don't need a license in the UK for owning and using a metal detector?
Yeah, you did understand that right. Yeah, Yes, you've never had to have a license to use it.
Why? How come?
I suppose, well, the hobby has been pretty widespread from the 1970s, and the initial response of most archaeologists, I think, was either to ban it or to try to license it. But for reasons which I think there was just no political capital invested in that. So, you know, that just wasn't interesting enough as a, you know, as a lobbying movement to get political traction. So it just didn't. Nobody got interested in terms of legislation. And there was also, that wasn't a uniform archaeological view, because one of the precursors to the Portable Antiquities scheme was a series of local collaborations where archaeologists locally had decided that trying to ban it was never going to work. I think partly there was no political will, because there wasn't, policing it would involve a lot of resources, and those resources, it would never have been a priority. So even if there'd been something on the statute books, it would have been impossible to get the police interested in it. So
yeah.
instead of doing that, what then some archaeologists tried to do was say, okay, let's try and work with people and see if we can encourage them to report stuff so that we can document it, maybe to try and get them to work within the framework of some archaeological projects rather than just detect independently wherever they could have access to it. But yeah, there has never been, and I'm sure will never be, a political will to ban it as a hobby. I mean, those places that do, I mean, also from experience of field work in Italy, from a prospection project, you know, you can see on the distant hills people using metal detectors, but you will never, you know, you'll never be able to know what they're finding, because their collections will remain illegal activity. Their collections will remain private. I should say that in comparison to parts of the Mediterranean or Eastern Europe, though there are problems intermittently with looting archaeological sites in the UK, which are sometimes quite serious, they're not on the same scale. So there isn't a connection to organised crime in the same way that, I mean, I hope I'm not speaking naively here in relation to Britain, but there isn't the scale and criminal framework doesn't exist in the UK in the same way that it does in some of the countries along the Danube, or in Italy and Greece and North Africa, or in Turkey. So that's,
yeah,
the situation is slightly, both the legislative situation and the kind of the nature of the hobby is different from other places.
Yeah, I think this matter of the, well, black market organized networks is connected more or less with what you can find in a certain area as well, because in Greece, in Italy, you will find stuff to really sell on the black market.
Yeah.
On the Roman limes, not so much. Maybe they are not worth going to jail for, or worse.
Yeah. What you do see, I mean, I know, I should also admit I have a biographical connection to the PAS. So I said at the beginning, okay, I don't work for the PAS, this is my perspective, but my wife does. So I kind of, you know, I kind of see it partly through her eyes, and that she used to be a finds liaison officer and would go along sometimes to rallies where you have detectorists.
Yeah.
You pay £50 and then you can just search on a field for 2 days. And at those rallies, people would turn up and open up their car boot, and you would see material that was clearly not from Britain, that had been, and typologically likely to have come from Romania or Bulgaria or Hungary, and had been brought in. And that's where this challenge comes at the PAS, because it's a pragmatic approach. Under the cover of the PAS, other things continue and maybe find it easier to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, or would have to happen underground.
Yeah, this is, well, it's choosing the lesser evil, I think. As I said in the beginning, we don't have perfect solutions for these matters anyway, even if they need a license or don't need a license. If somebody really wants to elude the law, he will or she will. But that was connected to what you said. That's one more thing I wanted to ask. Does this happen in the PAS? Did it happen to have, I don't know, finds reported from a place and to finds which you obviously know are not from that place, which you know for sure that come from an archaeological site from where they shouldn't have come? Or...
Yeah, and I can only speak anecdotally about that, but certainly in individual cases. So one was 3 or 4 years ago, a Roman altar, an inscribed Roman altar, it had a dedication to a god by a soldier, was reported to the Finds Liaison Officer in Lincolnshire, and the provenance was given was, as I said, my wife worked for the Portable Antiquities scheme. Her father is a farmer, and the provenance was the farm where she comes from. So, immediately from that, very suspicious. But the soldier was one from a legion that you'd never find attested in Britain. So clearly, it was being given a false provenance. Yeah. From a place where there's a lot of metal detected material. The finder said that they found it amongst the stones by the edge of the field, where the plough had dragged it. So you have that occasionally. You can see where a false provenance is very clearly being given. What also happens is one of the curious kind of psychological aspects is that, again, I'm speaking very anecdotally, is that there's always within people who use a metal detector, there's a lot of competition. Who has finds of a certain type, who has finds of a certain value, and I think that's always been there. And I think one of the things that the PAS has done is to kind of accentuate that somewhat. So it's not just that your peer group says, wow, that's a nice brooch, but you go along to the Finds Liaison Officer, yes, and they say, wow, amazing brooch, we haven't had one of those before. So you get that approval and that celebration of what you've done. And I think occasionally people have seen the same find come up, being told that it's come from a different place, and it seems to be part of this kind of psychological dynamic amongst detectors. And then there are occasionally finds that the same object is being reported from a different place, and the hypothesis is that probably someone's found it, sold it, and someone else is bringing it in, and people are either for these kind of competitive reasons or for illegal reasons, they're trying to give it a false prop. But as I say, my understanding is anecdotal, and it's a tiny number in comparison to the overall scale. But it's difficult to assess. To put a figure on it, you can say there are these weird cases. Overall, we think not. We hope not.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Have the PAS thought about actively gamifying this sense of competitiveness that you talk about? Because that's how a lot of crowdsourcing sites, they will have leaderboards of people who've entered the most pages of Jeremy Bentham or whatever the thing is. Have they thought about things like that actively that gamifies, that builds on that competitiveness, or might that be counterproductive, as you say?
Yes, it was interesting to read what Stuart Dunn said about that. One of the things that would be quite interesting to do now that this Past Explorers initiative has had a couple of years running, actually, is to see how that works. So at the moment they don't, as far as I know. But it's a bit frustrating. Nothing has been published about Past Explorers so far, beyond some very general stuff about we've got some money and this is broadly what we're doing. But actually, how it's worked as a different kind of crowdsourcing, as a different kind of public engagement, would be interesting to read about. I have tried to prompt, again, kind of coming across people in conversation, see, how might this pan out? But as far as I'm aware, it's not yet been done. It's not yet been done like that. I'm sure it would incentivize quite a lot of contributors because of the existing kind of competitiveness, that it would add another dimension to that. So I don't know, maybe it would also bring some unwelcome consequences, because one of the issues that I see working with doing intermittent research collaborations about Roman data is that the PAS, the Finds Liaison Officers, have to work with material over this vast chronological range. So inevitably the quality of records is a bit patchy, depending on what some individuals are more or less comfortable and confident with identifying and describing. So often, I was saying, research use, you can use it naively and a bit dangerously to produce a distribution map and think that's the truth. but also often you have to do quite a lot of work cleaning up the data. And I worry that if you sort of incentivize, you'd have to incentivize quite carefully in order not just to focus on numbers of records, because often, tends to be, quality declines as number goes up. I mean, again, it's an issue, there's one of the political issues is the absolute numbers have been used when new funding applications have been made. Look, we've just had our millionth object, but sort of the quality quantity thing is a tricky one. So any kind of gamification would have to take that into account, because you don't want endless layers of quality control, which one of the areas where the cuts have happened is to the specialist finds advisors. They now have much less time, so there's less scope for validating material. So you can't say it's all right, we'll create loads of basic records and then an expert can check them, because the experts just don't have the time to do that. So yeah, it'd be a nice thing to play with.
The thing that immediately jumps to mind there is the idea of, could we crowdsource the expert validation?
Yes.
From professional archaeologists. And
yes.
Like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was trying to think this morning when kind of thinking, okay, how much time have I got per slide? Because there's already, as it were, some semi-visible crowdsourcing in that, okay, the finds advisor for Roman or medieval might get asked, okay, well, I think this is your period. What is it? Actually, I don't know, but I know someone who might. So there are a certain number of individuals who regularly get called upon. I mean, for example, objects that have Roman objects that have images of gods or monsters or mythological creatures. Martin Hennig in Oxford regularly gets emailed, say, Martin, what do you think? What do you think one of these is? Or depending on what it is, my wife sometimes asks me if I recognize it. So there's that is there, and there may be a way of trying to do that a bit more systematically to crowdsource, and especially maybe to internationally crowdsource, because one of the interesting things is there are quite a lot of individual artifact types where the typology for the UK didn't previously incorporate them. And I don't think that's because these are finds that are being given a false provenance. It's just that for some artifacts we didn't have a very big corpus, and now we have a really big corpus, but the best parallels are there's a very nice brooch from the Isle of Wight it's a brooch with a monogram on it, and the monogram it's either Roma or Amor. You can read it both ways. And these have only been found previously in Romania and in Switzerland. And there are several objects of this kind where you think, okay, we think we've got it, but probably there's somewhere sitting in a museum in Romania or Zurich who will instantly know what it is, and maybe trying to develop a community of expert users in that way would be a nice thing to do.
Is there a flag for validation status in individual records?
That's a good question, and certainly there used to be.
Yes, it is. I've just looked on the website this afternoon. Cool. Yes, it is a flag, and it says if the object was validated or not. The entry, not.
Yes, I can't remember now quite how the process works. So it may be that now, I speak a bit hesitantly here, I think now kind of everything gets released, whether it's validated or not, but then it flags to tell you whether it is or not. In the past, I think it had to wait for validation, but the trouble is that became completely unwieldy. In the end, the traffic jam would build up of hundreds or thousands of objects waiting for validation. So
yes, I've seen objects with full entries, quite detailed entries, but they had a little flag and which said the object is still waiting for
for validation. Yeah. So presumably, rather, you're using this as a non-registered. You're using this as a public.
Yes. I've just entered on the website to see.
Search and had a look.
To play around.
I think at the moment there's a kind of pre-validation status that is still in place, especially where the find spot of an object is especially sensitive. So the key thing that public users don't get is sufficient geographical precision to enable them, to go into the field with their detector and find it. So, and there are some sites where there's quite a lot of concern about, how do you how do you make this information available? Let's see what we, sometimes records lie dormant while there's negotiation with landowners and so on about how to disseminate. So often, especially as a public user, as well as the map being limited, often the name of the site you'll get will give you sort of very little precision. So you'll get the name of the nearest the local government district, which will cover tens of square kilometers. So to try and protect the find spot.
Okay. So does anybody have any more questions?
If no one else does, I wanted to just ask a question sort of about the broader context of this semester's syllabus, just sort of trying to link this to some of the other topics we were talking about. The two major topics that will come up repeatedly in this semester are geographic technologies and 3D technologies. Yeah. And you've given some examples of mapping and shown distribution visualizations and so forth. And so one thing I wondered if we could maybe speculate about a little bit more, and Tom may have some suggestions here as well, and Valeria, is ways in which PAS data could be used, either unregistered users or if any of our students registered as research users could download the data and use that in the context of learning about GIS, learning about geovisualization, and what sorts of data they would get in those two circumstances, and what sorts of exercises they could do with it. And you've made some very useful comments about being sure to contextualize it and show be aware of the biases and that sort of thing. But I wonder if anyone, either you or anyone else, had any thoughts about ways in which PAS could be used as a data set for GIS or geovisualization exercises.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit hesitant with Tom Elliott sitting watching to speak. I think, I mean, once you get registered as a research user, then you get the full, the data with the full precision. So the Ordnance Survey data, 12-figure data, so you get it as precise as is available. You can download it, in a variety of formats and start to play with it. I think.
Presumably, you're asked not to redistribute that.
Sorry.
Presumably, you're asked not to redistribute that.
Yeah. So it's
even indirectly.
Yes, as part of kind of getting research validation, you'll typically need, especially if you're a student, you'll need a referee. So your advisor will probably need to write in your support. So I think once you've got, I mean, the distribution map stuff is fairly easy, but after a certain point becomes not very helpful, because for quite a few categories of data, the distribution on the ground is so dense that you just get spaces covered in black dots. So I think the kinds of things that have been played around with, like kernel density plotting, kind of ways of trying to represent densities. And I suppose here there are potential overlaps with, HER data is often equally rich, and people have said in, I don't know, the project, the repeated reviews of the Ordnance Survey map of Roman Britain. You can now, compared to Crawford in the 1920s, you could never hope to possibly map every Roman dot, even leaving aside PAS data. So how do you try and represent density, or do you select, or what do you? So this is where kind of manipulating PAS data and manipulating HER data, both are kind of very large scale data sets that can be classified and differentiated up to a point. That kind of playing around seems to have possibilities to it, possibilities that have the potential of which has been partly demonstrated through work by Katie Robbins or Tom Brindle, trying to do various kinds of clustering analysis to see how you can not just map dots but tug things together. One of the big challenges is, how do you identify a site from PAS data? What does a dot mean? And you can play with clustering and kernel density. It varies, and you have to make an awful lot of allowances for background densities and background distributions. A cluster in Norfolk will not be the same as the cluster in Worcestershire. So that, you know, there are all kinds of nuances that you'd need to introduce into that. But I think, you know, nice project, as you know, currently not being done so much with, you know, intermittently when it, you know, one gets funding to support a PhD. You know, the PhDs I've supported have been in collaboration with the BM. So we used to have input. Dan Pett, when his time was dedicated to the PAS, Dan was quite involved in this, but he's not available to do that in the same way anymore, which is, as an aside, is a great shame, because it's not the database is not as dynamic as it once was. So intermittently one plays these kind of games when you get research students who are interested in them, and here in King's when one gets the geographers to collaborate. But that happens sporadically. I'm sure there's a lot of scope for systematic work there. And now that this might be, I alluded very much in passing to some of the PAS type projects being set up in continental Europe. So in the Netherlands, the equivalent project is already up and running, but is in that kind of still that developmental stage. So trying to think with them maybe about how the geographical aspect of the information can be used. I did think here's Valeria.
John, I have a question. Is it possible to download selectively from the PIS, like select just the findings in one region, or
so
finding of one kind?
Yeah, so what you download depends very much on what you've searched for. So, you know, if you've searched for Roman brooches from Hertfordshire, then you'll get Roman brooches from Hertfordshire or from one small area of Hertfordshire. I'm not sure, as a research user, I'm not sure up to what scale you can download. I think downloading the entire data set is tricky for practical reasons, and it may be excluded. The terms of the license may not allow you to do that. But you can download very small, nuanced data sets or significantly larger ones. You know, you can frame the search in order to condition the scale that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think this would be, you know, much more useful maybe for the students to play with, if they can select just a part of the database and maybe compare distribution of two different things.
Yes, I think that would be a nice exercise. I mean, in a lot of cases as well, the historic environment data you can get access to as a research student. So taking a case study area, you know, a part of Roman Worcestershire or Roman York, and looking at how different data sets compare to one another would be a nice kind of appropriate scale exercise, you know, without overwhelming quantities of material to compare or think about.
Yeah, and in terms of geovisualization exercise, downloading a selection of data, a relatively small selection, you know, hundreds rather than millions of records, based on maybe 2 or 3 criteria, not necessarily geography, but you know, whatever criteria, and then using the other criteria that you haven't selected by to visualize on. So if you select on region and date and find, you know, context, for example, and then you use object type and material, say, as the things to visualize on, or vice versa. You know, just look only for things made of bronze made of gold from the Roman period, and then visualize them based on whether they were found by metal detectorists or not, and you know, or whatever the object, you know, whatever data is in the database. Those because the richness of the data is
kind of separating out, bringing to prominence one particular criterion against the background. I think there's all to play for, really. I think. Really.
Yeah, that could be a lot of fun. Yeah. And as Valeria says, comparing against other data sets. You know, data got from elsewhere of the same region, and plot them against each other and see how they compare.
Yes, I mean, you know, there are big data sets available for land use, relief, you know, all kinds of topographic data sets that one can do, and remains, you know, there are in it. Tom and Katie Robbins' PhDs did some initial exploration of that, but there remains an awful lot of unexploited potential.
I've noticed that a couple of times Tom has unmuted and leaned forward and then stopped and muted again, so maybe we've cut him off.
Can't hear you, Tom.
We can't hear you, Tom.
No, we still can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
We'll have to work on that.
Yeah. So, okay.
So just the other thing, I know we're sort of out of time, but the other aspect of it that I wondered if anyone might have any thoughts about, or maybe we could go away and have thoughts about individually, is whether there's any potential for interface between the portable antiquities data and any of the various 3D technologies that we're going to talk about in this module.
Can I say, I think it would be fantastic if that was possible. I've just intermittently I work on individual objects that come through the scheme, and the main you almost never see them as objects. You're only seeing them through the existing description and the photos. But recently I was working with some of the archaeologists at the University of Leicester Archaeological Service who found this fabulous Roman key handle that's got what looks like a damnatio scene going on it, with this kind of barbarian and lions and cowering spectators. And I've not been in Leicester to see it, but they've created a 3D visualization of it as it's gone through various conservation stages, and it is so much easier to use that than to use the photographs to actually properly describe and interpret the object. I mean, I think that's another area where, if with some enhancement of the PAS data set, that would be, especially as this now becomes possible to do fairly quickly and cheaply and easily on selected artifacts. I mean, for some things, obviously, for bringing out the three-dimensionality, like a Roman coin, you don't need to do that with. But for an object like a knife handle, with sculpture, with sculpted in quite high relief, it makes a fantastic difference in terms of understanding.
If you happen to know, has the PAS ever link out to images on Sketchfab as well as just photographs?
The honest answer is I don't know. I'm not aware of any, but I don't think so.
No, I wouldn't. I don't think so either. But John, if you can get hold of one of the objects and want to bring it to the photogrammetry class that we're going to have with the students, we can image it for you.
Okay, yeah, I can try. I'll ask my wife. He has objects passing through. We had a fabulous, larger than life-size finger from a Roman monumental bronze statue. When that passed through, I was able to take that into my son's primary school, which was quite a nice thing to do. Sal doesn't have that anymore, but I'm sure we've got other objects that you can use for that. So yeah, if separately, tell me when you would need it.
We can make it a prototype.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'll ask her. So just say when you need it, and I'll bring in a Tupperware box.
Sure, looking forward to it.
Right. Okay.
Okay, everybody. If this is it, we are so late because this was a very, very interesting session indeed. Thank you very much, John.
I can see Tom messaging there, muted.
Yes, we got it, Tom. Well, thank you everybody from the Hangouts and everybody who watched the session on YouTube. And see you not next Thursday, in 2 weeks from now.
Thanks very much.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.